The quickest way to lose a fight over property is to assume the other person never bothered to read the county records. I did not fully understand that lesson until the Tuesday morning I drove home from the feed mill and noticed something that made me lift my foot off the gas pedal without even thinking about it. The first thing I saw was sunlight. For more than 40 years, the western edge of my farm had been hidden behind a thick stand of white oaks, sugar maples, and towering eastern pines. Every morning those trees caught the sunrise before it reached my pasture. That day the light hit the front fence long before I turned into my driveway. At first I honestly wondered if I had taken the wrong road. Then I saw the hillside. 25 acres of woods were simply gone. Fresh stumps stretched across the ridge where my father had spent decades planting trees one spring at a time. Deep equipment tracks carved through the earth. Broken branches lay piled beside muddy tire marks. The smell of fresh pine drifted across the field so strongly that it overpowered the scent of hay in the back of my truck. I parked beside the barn and climbed out without saying a word. The feed bags stayed where they were. Somehow unloading them no longer seemed very important. I stood there trying to understand what I was looking at. My father bought this farm in 1978 after retiring from the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He always said he had not bought beautiful land. He had bought land worth improving. Every spring he planted another handful of seedlings, never expecting to enjoy the full forest himself. My wife Eleanor used to joke that he was growing shade for people he would never meet. Looking across that empty hillside, I realized those people might have been me. Then I heard applause. I looked uphill toward Cedar Hollow Estates. Nearly 24 homeowners stood along the community overlook holding coffee cups while admiring the valley that had suddenly opened beyond my property. A local realtor handed glossy brochures to a young couple while pointing toward the mountains in the distance. Standing comfortably in the middle of the group was Vanessa Caldwell, president of the Homeowners Association. White blazer, large sunglasses, perfect smile. She looked less like someone inspecting completed work and more like someone hosting a grand opening. The moment she noticed me, she waved. "Benjamin," she called. "Beautiful, is it not? Everyone finally gets the mountain view they paid for." A few people laughed. Someone raised a coffee cup toward me, as though I should be celebrating too. I walked quietly across the pasture until I reached the nearest stump. Fresh sap still glistened across the smooth cut. That particular oak had already been taller than the farmhouse when Eleanor and I got married. I rested my hand against it for only a second before looking farther up the clearing. That was when I noticed something I almost ignored. Near the middle of the hillside stood a faded orange survey marker. Bulldozers had worked around it. Logging equipment had driven past it. Everything surrounding it had changed except that single marker. I remember thinking it was strange. Nothing more. Certainly not important. Looking back, that was probably the biggest mistake I made all week. Behind me, Vanessa continued talking about stronger property values, happier homeowners, and a brighter future for the neighborhood. She never mentioned who actually owned the land everyone was enjoying. "You certainly changed the landscape," I said. She smiled as though I had just complimented her work. "Progress usually upsets someone at first," she replied. "People almost always thank us later." I nodded politely because arguing would not bring back one tree. As I turned toward my truck, I noticed one of the logging supervisors standing beside his pickup. Unlike everyone else, he was not looking at the mountains. He was looking at that faded orange survey marker. Then he looked at me. Our eyes met for just a second before he lowered his clipboard and quietly walked away. At the time, I thought almost nothing of it. 3 days later, that same man knocked on my front door, and I realized the missing trees were only the beginning of the story. 3 days later, just after 8 on Friday morning, someone knocked on my front door. I remember the time because I had only taken 2 sips from my second cup of coffee when I heard it. Through the kitchen window, I saw a dark blue pickup parked beside my mailbox. The logo on the driver's door read Appalachian Timber Services. For a moment, I assumed they had come to apologize or deliver paperwork. Instead, a tall man in a faded work shirt climbed out carrying a weathered survey map tube under one arm. Before he walked toward the porch, he looked back at the county road as though making certain no one else had followed him. "Mr. Whitmore?" he asked after I opened the door. "Benjamin is fine," I replied. He extended his hand. "Daniel Mercer." I supervised the logging crew. His handshake was firm, but there was something uneasy about him. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other and glanced toward the ridge before speaking again. "I hope I am not causing any trouble by stopping here." That depends on what you came to tell me, I said with a small smile. For the first time since he arrived, he smiled back. Fair enough. I invited him inside, but he shook his head. Actually, could we look at something outside? We walked over to my pickup, and he unrolled a large field survey across the tailgate. Colored lines marked equipment routes. Handwritten notes filled the margins. Small circles identified survey references used during the logging operation. Daniel pointed to several locations where his crew had confirmed permanent county markers before bringing heavy equipment onto the property. This is standard procedure, he explained. We verify everything ourselves. Then his pencil stopped on one small circle near the middle of my land. The faded orange survey marker. Except this one. I looked at him without saying anything. The authorization package we received stated that this marker had already been field verified during an earlier inspection, he continued. We were instructed not to disturb it and not to repeat the measurement. He paused for a moment before quietly adding, that is unusual. We almost never skip a verification. I looked back toward the ridge. So why are you here now? Daniel reached into the map tube and removed several photographs taken during the project. Every picture showed bulldozers working around the marker without touching it. Yesterday, one of our survey technicians was closing the project file, he said. He noticed something that did not sit right with him. He handed me one of the photographs. That marker never moved. Not even an inch. I studied the image for several seconds. At first, I still did not understand why that mattered. Daniel seemed to notice the expression on my face. If the original county reference point stayed exactly where it belonged, he said carefully, someone should have confirmed what it was tied to before anyone approved removing those trees. Neither of us spoke for a few moments. The only sound came from the old windmill behind the equipment shed turning slowly in the morning breeze. Finally, Daniel reached into his shirt pocket and handed me a business card. On the back, he had written a name and a direct telephone number. That belongs to a records clerk at the county planning department, he said. I cannot tell you what is in your property file because I honestly do not know. But if this were my land, I would ask the county to retrieve every archived record connected to your parcel before anybody starts celebrating what they think they accomplished. I slipped the card into my wallet and thanked him for making the drive. He nodded once before walking back toward his truck. Just before opening the driver's door, he stopped and looked at the cleared hillside one more time. Mr. Whitmore, he said, I have been doing this work for 22 years. The ground almost always tells the truth. Sometimes it just takes the paperwork a little longer to catch up. After he drove away, I finished my coffee, picked up my truck keys, and headed toward the county courthouse. At that point, I still believed I was looking for an explanation. By the end of the afternoon, I realized I was actually looking for a file that someone else had probably hoped would stay forgotten. The planning department occupied the second floor of a modest brick building across from the county courthouse. I had been there before to file timber management reports and update property records, so nothing about the place surprised me. The waiting area still had the same wooden chairs, the same faded aerial photograph of the county hanging on the wall, and the same coffee machine that somehow always smelled better than the coffee it actually made. Small county offices have a way of resisting change. That is probably why people trust them. I walked to the front counter and handed the clerk the business card Daniel Mercer had given me. I would like to review every public record connected to my property, I said. She smiled politely, typed my parcel number into the computer, and then stopped. It was not dramatic. She simply looked at the screen a second time before typing the number again. One moment, please, Mr. Whitmore. She disappeared through a doorway marked Records Access, carrying a standard property folder. I took a seat beneath the aerial photograph and waited. Around me, the office carried on exactly as it always had. Telephones rang. Printers hummed. Someone down the hall was discussing a building permit with a contractor. For several minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Then the same clerk returned without the folder. She spoke quietly to another employee, who walked over to her computer and studied the screen for a few seconds. He frowned slightly, opened another program, compared two records, then disappeared through the same doorway. This time he came back holding an archive request form instead of a property file. Mr. Whitmore, he said, it appears your parcel has an archived county record stored off-site. Off-site? I asked. He nodded. Some older files are preserved separately because of their size or historical importance. We will need to retrieve it. How long does that usually take? 2 business days, sometimes less. He He slid the request form across the counter. If you sign here, we will notify you as soon as it arrives. I signed without hesitation. There was no point trying to rush people whose job depended on accuracy. As I handed the form back, another employee quietly walked over and asked the clerk, "Is that the Whitmore parcel?" She nodded. He looked toward me for only a moment before lowering his voice. I could not hear what he said, but I noticed both of them glance at the computer screen again before he disappeared into another office carrying a yellow routing folder. It was a small moment, but it caught my attention. Government employees usually become quieter, not louder, when they find something important. Walking back toward my truck, I still had far more questions than answers. I did not know what was inside the archived file. I did not know why it had been placed in long-term storage. Most importantly, I still did not know whether any of it had anything to do with the missing trees. On the drive home, I stopped at Miller's Diner for lunch. Before I even reached the counter, Carl spotted me from his usual booth and waved me over. "Well?" he asked with a grin. "Did they tell you anything?" I shook my head. "Not yet." He laughed. "Around here, not yet usually means something interesting is coming." As if on cue, the television mounted above the counter switched to a local real estate advertisement. There was Cedar Hollow Estates, showing drone footage of the newly opened Mountain View. Vanessa Caldwell appeared briefly on the screen, smiling as a narrator talked about thoughtful planning and lasting value. Then the camera lingered on the cleared hillside for several seconds before the commercial ended. Even Carl noticed it. "That was your ridge, wasn't it?" he asked. "It was," I replied. He took another sip of coffee before quietly saying, "Funny thing about advertisements. They always tell you what somebody wants you to see." I looked back toward the courthouse through the diner window. Somewhere inside that building, people were retrieving a file that nobody had looked at in years. And for the first time since those trees came down, I had the feeling I was not the only person waiting for it to arrive. The next 2 days passed more slowly than I expected. The county clerk had promised to call as soon as the archived file arrived. But until then, there was nothing I could do except get back to work. That was probably for the best. Farms have a way of reminding you that life keeps moving whether you are ready or not. I repaired a section of fence along the south pasture, serviced the tractor before the fall harvest, and finally unloaded the feed bags that had been sitting in the back of my pickup since Tuesday. Every now and then I would glance toward the ridge. No matter how many times I looked, it still did not seem like my property. Late Wednesday afternoon, I decided to walk across the clearing for the first time since the logging crews had finished. Without the trees, the hillside felt strangely exposed. The afternoon wind swept straight across the ridge without slowing down, carrying dust where it used to carry the smell of pine needles. The narrow trail Eleanor and I had walked almost every evening had disappeared beneath tire tracks and scattered with chips. For a moment, I honestly had trouble remembering exactly where the path had been. That bothered me more than I expected. I stopped beside one of the largest stumps and counted the growth rings until I lost my place somewhere past 60. That oak had already been standing when my father bought the farm after retiring from the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Every spring he planted a few more seedlings, even during years when money was tight. He used to laugh whenever neighbors asked why he bothered planting trees he would never live long enough to harvest. "Because somebody will," he always answered. At the time I thought he was talking about timber. Standing there that afternoon, I realized he had been talking about stewardship instead. After Eleanor passed away, those woods became part of my routine. Most evenings I carried a cup of coffee along the same trail before sunset. She always preferred the woods to the overlook. "Mountains are easy," she once told me. "Growing a forest takes patience." I smiled, remembering that, because she probably would have rolled her eyes at everyone celebrating a view they had done nothing to create. As I turned back toward the barn, something caught my attention near the old trail entrance. Half buried beneath fresh sawdust stood a weathered cedar post no taller than my knee. Years earlier, Eleanor had painted a small wooden trail marker that hung from it. The sign itself had disappeared, but the cedar post remained exactly where we had planted it. I brushed away the sawdust with my boot and stood there for a second. Then I looked uphill toward the faded orange survey marker. It suddenly struck me that the only two things left standing on the entire hillside were markers. One had been placed there by my family. The other had been placed there by the county. I still had no idea why either one mattered, but somehow both had survived while everything else had disappeared. Thursday morning, my telephone finally rang. It was the county clerk. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "your archived property file has arrived." He paused briefly before continuing. "You may want to allow yourself a little extra time when you come in. The file is considerably larger than we expected, and several documents are still listed as active." I thanked him, wrote down my appointment, and hung up. Before climbing into my truck, I looked one last time toward the empty ridge. 2 days earlier, I believed the missing trees were the biggest story on that hillside. As I drove toward the courthouse, I had the unmistakable feeling the county was about to show me something far more important than anything the logging crews had taken away. I arrived at the county administration building the next morning a few minutes before 8. The courthouse annex looked exactly the way I remembered it. The brass directory near the entrance still listed departments that had occupied the same offices for decades. Faded aerial photographs of local farms lined the hallway. Even the old clock above the records division counter was running about 3 minutes slow, just as it always had. Small county buildings rarely impressed anyone, but they had earned my respect years ago. People there cared far more about accuracy than appearances. The clerk recognized me immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "We have your file ready." He disappeared through a secure records room and returned pushing a rolling cart with a large gray archive box resting on top. Even before he placed it on the research table, I realized Daniel Mercer had been right. Whatever this was, it was much bigger than an ordinary property folder. "Take all the time you need," the clerk said before, leaving me alone. I lifted the lid and carefully untied the faded cotton ribbon securing the first bundle of documents. Survey plats, engineering drawings, soil reports, environmental correspondence, meeting minutes, inspection summaries. Every folder was organized chronologically, and every page carried county stamps, handwritten initials, or official signatures. Whoever assembled the file believed future generations should be able to understand every decision without guessing. My father would have appreciated that. He always believed good records were every bit as valuable as good fences. Nearly an hour passed before I reached the final section. Tucked beneath several engineering reports sat a sealed county envelope marked supplemental conditions. The paper had yellowed with age, but the official seal had never been broken. I opened it carefully. Inside were several inspection photographs along with handwritten field memoranda prepared by county surveyors. The first photograph immediately caught my attention. 2 surveyors stood beside the same faded orange marker that still remained on my hillside. Additional photographs showed measuring equipment extending from that marker to permanent county control points located across neighboring parcels. I read every note twice. The language was technical, but one point appeared again and again. Those reference markers established the legal field control supporting a recorded county approval attached to my property. They were never intended to be temporary construction markers. They existed to preserve the accuracy of something expected to remain valid for many years. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the photograph again. Suddenly Daniel's visit made perfect sense. His crew had avoided disturbing the marker because someone told them it had already been verified. The problem was that nobody appeared to have confirmed exactly what the marker was protecting before authorizing the clearing. Just then there was a light knock on the open research room door. The senior records clerk stepped inside, holding a folder. "Mr. Whitmore," he said politely, "would you mind if I looked at one of those photographs?" I handed him the page. He adjusted his glasses, studied it for several seconds, then compared it with something inside the folder he had brought. He frowned ever so slightly before looking back at me. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Everything connected to this county approval still appears to be listed as active." He excused himself without offering another explanation. A few moments later, I noticed him speaking softly with another employee outside the room. Neither of them sounded concerned. They sounded careful. That was an important difference. Careful people usually find answers. Concerned people usually look for someone to blame. I requested certified copies of every document inside the supplemental section. While the copier quietly worked through the pages, I watched 2 planning employees place a yellow review tab on my property file before carrying it into another office. Whatever they had found, they wanted another set of eyes to confirm it. As I stepped outside carrying the certified copies, my telephone rang. Vanessa Caldwell. I answered after the second ring. "Benjamin," she said pleasantly, "I wanted to personally invite you to our community open house this weekend. There has been a lot of unnecessary speculation lately, and I hope we can all move forward together. I looked down at the county seal embossed across the top page in my hands before answering. I have not been speculating, Vanessa. She hesitated. Then what have you been doing? I smiled without realizing it. Reading. The silence that followed lasted much longer than either of us expected. Then she quietly thanked me for my time and ended the call. It was the first conversation we had shared where confidence changed sides without either of us raising our voices. The weekend arrived, and Cedar Hollow Estates looked busier than I had ever seen it. Every parking space near the clubhouse was full before lunchtime. Families wandered through open houses carrying paper brochures while real estate agents pointed toward the valley beyond my property as though the scenery itself were part of the sales package. On my way to the feed mill that Saturday morning, I slowed just enough to hear one agent telling a young couple, "The best part is that nothing can ever block this view." I almost smiled. 2 weeks earlier, I probably would have believed in myself. Now I knew better than to trust a promise that had never been checked against the county records. After picking up livestock feed, I stopped at Miller's Diner for lunch. Carl was already there, stirring his coffee while watching a local news segment on the television above the counter. The commercial break began, and there was Cedar Hollow Estates again. Drone footage swept across the newly cleared hillside while a narrator described breathtaking mountain views and thoughtful community planning. Carl looked from the television to me and quietly shook his head. "Funny thing about advertisements," he said. "They always show you what somebody wants people to believe." "Sometimes," I replied. "The paperwork tells a different story." He raised an eyebrow but did not ask another question. Back at the farm on Monday morning, I met Rebecca Lawson in her office overlooking the courthouse square. I handed her the certified copies from the county archive without trying to explain what I thought they meant. Rebecca had practiced real estate law long enough to know that first impressions were less valuable than complete records. For nearly 45 minutes, she read every page without speaking. Occasionally, she made a short note on a yellow legal pad or placed a small tab between two documents. When she reached the end of the supplemental conditions, she closed the binder, removed her reading glasses, and looked out the window toward the courthouse. "Benjamin," she said, "everyone has been focused on the wrong question." I leaned back in my chair. "Which question?" She tapped the photograph of the faded orange survey marker. "Everyone keeps asking whether the trees should have been removed." She paused. "The better question is why this marker mattered enough for the county to document it so carefully in the first place." That was the first time anyone besides Daniel Mercer had spoken about the marker as though it were more important than the missing forest itself. Rebecca immediately called the county planning department. She did not ask for legal advice or opinions. She simply requested written confirmation that every document connected to the archived county approval remained part of the active public record. Government offices appreciate precise questions. By Wednesday afternoon, the answer arrived. Rebecca read the letter once, smiled almost imperceptibly, and slipped it into a new binder labeled County Correspondence. "Is that good news?" I asked. "It is reliable news," she answered. "That is usually even better." Later that afternoon, a licensed county surveyor met us at the farm carrying modern GPS equipment, historical plats, and copies of the original engineering drawings. He spent nearly 3 hours comparing archived measurements with the permanent reference points scattered across my property. When he reached the faded orange survey marker, he checked its coordinates twice before writing several notes into his field book. As he packed away his equipment, he walked over to Rebecca and me. "The original field control remains exactly where the county recorded it," he said. "That does not happen very often after this many years." Before either of us could ask another question, another pickup turned into my driveway. Daniel Mercer climbed out carrying a sealed envelope filled with survey photographs, equipment logs, and work reports from the logging project. "I figured your attorney should have the complete file," he said. Rebecca thanked him before placing everything into the binder. As Daniel turned to leave, he looked once more toward the empty hillside. "We trusted the signatures," he said quietly. Nobody stopped to verify what those signatures actually referred to. Just before sunset, my telephone rang. Vanessa Caldwell. Her voice was as calm and confident as ever. "Benjamin," she said, "I think it would be helpful if you joined the Homeowners Association board for a private meeting Thursday evening. I am sure we can clear up a few misunderstandings before they become unnecessary problems." I accepted without hesitation. After I hung up, Rebecca closed the binder and looked at me for a moment. She still thinks this is a conversation, she said. By the end of the week, it is going to become a record. Thursday evening arrived with the first cool breeze of early fall. Rebecca Lawson met me outside the Cedar Hollow Estates clubhouse carrying the same two binders she had been organizing all week. One held the certified county records. The other contained Daniel Mercer's survey photographs, contractor logs, and every document collected since the trees came down. She carried them without saying a word. Good attorneys know that sometimes the quietest person in the room controls the conversation. Inside, the atmosphere felt nothing like the celebration I had witnessed 2 weeks earlier. The promotional displays advertising mountain views had disappeared. The coffee station sat untouched in one corner. Several board members spoke quietly among themselves until Vanessa Caldwell walked in, straightened the sleeves of her white blazer, and smiled as though she were about to begin another routine board meeting. "Benjamin," she said warmly, "thank you for coming. I believe this entire situation has become much larger than it needs to be." I returned the smile. "That depends on who is measuring it." She laughed politely, although I could tell she was trying to decide whether I was joking. The association attorney opened the meeting by explaining that the board hoped to resolve a few misunderstandings before county officials completed their review. Rebecca quietly placed a single certified letter in front of him. Not the archive, not the photographs. Just the county's written confirmation that an active county approval remained attached to my parcel. The attorney read it carefully before passing it to the board member beside him. One after another, each director studied the page without speaking. Finally, an older gentleman near the end of the table cleared his throat. "Vanessa," he asked, "were we aware there was still an active county approval connected to Mr. Whitmore's property?" Vanessa answered without hesitation. The contractor assured us every necessary document had already been reviewed. Rebecca remained perfectly calm. The contractor relied on the authorization package provided to them. The county relies on its own official records. Those are not always the same documents. Silence settled over the room. The attorney adjusted his glasses and looked back toward Rebecca. "Can you tell us what this approval authorizes?" Rebecca gently closed the binder instead of opening it. "The county is still completing its administrative review. I think everyone will benefit from hearing that explanation directly from the people responsible for maintaining those records." Vanessa leaned forward. "Surely we do not need county inspectors walking through the neighborhood over a misunderstanding." Rebecca met her eyes without raising her voice. "Inspectors do not visit because of misunderstandings. They visit because someone asks them to verify the public record." No one challenged that statement. There simply was not much left to argue about. As the meeting ended, several board members quietly gathered around the association attorney, asking questions in voices too low to hear. Vanessa walked Rebecca and me into the parking lot. She stopped beside my truck and folded her arms. "Benjamin," she asked, "what exactly do you think the county is looking for tomorrow?" I looked past the clubhouse toward the dark outline of the ridge. "I do not think they are looking for anything," I answered. "I think they already know what they are looking for. Tomorrow they are simply going to confirm whether it is still there." Vanessa did not reply immediately. For the first time since this began, she looked toward the hillside instead of toward me. Rebecca placed both binders inside the truck before quietly closing the passenger door. "Get some rest," she said as we climbed in. "Tomorrow nobody's opinion is going to matter nearly as much as a measuring tape." As we drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The board members were still standing beneath the parking lot lights, watching us leave. 2 weeks earlier, they had celebrated a view. Tonight, they were waiting for a county inspection. The difference between those two moments was nothing more than a few forgotten records. But by the following afternoon, those records were about to become the only thing anyone in Cedar Hollow Estates wanted to talk about. County vehicles began arriving just after 8 o'clock the following morning. There were no flashing lights, no television cameras, and no dramatic speeches. Government inspections rarely look exciting unless you understand what you are watching. 3 pickup trucks from the planning department parked along the county road, followed by a survey vehicle from the engineering office. Within minutes, tripods stood across the cleared hillside, GPS equipment was calibrated, and inspectors quietly unfolded historical plats across the hood of a county truck. Rebecca Lawson stood beside me with one of the binders tucked beneath her arm. Daniel Mercer waited several yards away with two members of his survey crew in case the county had questions about the logging operation. Across the fence, Vanessa Caldwell stood with the Homeowners Association board. She was still wearing the same white blazer she seemed to wear whenever cameras, meetings, or important announcements were involved. Every few minutes, she checked her phone before slipping it back into her pocket. The confidence was still there, but now it looked rehearsed. For nearly 2 hours, the inspectors moved methodically from one survey point to another. They measured the faded orange marker from multiple directions, verified permanent county monuments, compared modern GPS coordinates with archived engineering drawings, and photographed every location identified in the historical records. No one rushed. No one speculated. Every measurement was checked twice before it was written into a field notebook. At one point, a younger surveyor frowned at his tablet and quietly asked the senior inspector to confirm a reading. The senior inspector repeated the measurement himself, nodded once, and wrote something in the margin of the original survey plat. That tiny exchange caught everyone's attention. Even Vanessa stopped looking at her phone. Around noon, the lead planning inspector gathered everyone near the center of the clearing. He rested a weathered county binder on the hood of his truck and reviewed one final page before speaking. "The field verification is complete," he said calmly. "All permanent survey control points identified in the original county record remain in their documented locations." Another inspector handed him a signed worksheet. He glanced at it before continuing. "The administrative review further confirms that the county approval associated with this parcel remains active within the current public record." Silence settled over the hillside. Finally, Vanessa stepped forward. "What approval?" she asked. The inspector looked at her politely. "Our responsibility today was to determine whether the historical conditions supporting that approval still existed." "They do." He closed the binder without another word. Rebecca accepted a certified copy of the preliminary findings and quietly slipped it into her folder. Daniel leaned toward her. "So the survey marker was never really the important part." Rebecca smiled slightly. "It mattered because it proved the county's original field control never changed. Once that was confirmed, everything else became much easier to verify." Late that afternoon, the county released its written administrative findings. Every interested party received the same report. The document confirmed that the historical county approval attached to my property had never expired, had never been revoked, and remained fully enforceable under existing regulations. Then came the paragraph everyone read twice. The approved agricultural observation structure described in the original filing had never been canceled, abandoned, or replaced. It simply had never been built. One of the homeowners quietly lowered the report and looked toward Vanessa. "Does that mean he can still build it?" he asked. Before anyone else could answer, the lead inspector replied in the same calm voice he had used all day. "The county record speaks for itself." No one said another word. Even the real estate agent who had spent the previous weekend promising permanent mountain views quietly folded the remaining brochures under his arm and walked back toward his car. Vanessa remained standing where she was, reading the final page one more time before slowly lowering it. For the first time since my woods disappeared, she was not looking at the mountains. She was looking at the ridge itself, finally realizing that the county had not discovered a new problem. It had simply rediscovered an old right that had been patiently waiting in the public record long before Cedar Hollow Estates had ever existed. The county did not authorize construction the next morning, and that was exactly how it should have been. Over the following several weeks, engineers completed their final reviews, inspectors signed off on each remaining requirement, and every document connected to the historical county approval was verified one last time. Nobody rushed the process. Nobody asked for special treatment. That was one of the reasons I had always trusted county records. They moved slowly enough to get things right. By early autumn, licensed contractors arrived at my farm carrying copies of approved engineering plans, inspection schedules, and every permit required to begin work. Before a single piece of equipment moved onto the ridge, county surveyors re-established their control points using the same faded orange marker that had quietly survived the clearing operation. I found myself looking at it more than once. The funny thing was that I barely noticed it for years while the trees were standing. Once the trees disappeared, that little piece of painted steel turned out to be the most important object on the entire hillside. Construction moved exactly the way the county drawings said it would. Inspectors stopped by regularly, compared measurements against the archived engineering plans, signed their reports, and left. There were no emergency hearings, no courtroom arguments, no dramatic last-minute appeals. The law did not need excitement. It simply needed people willing to follow it. Over the next several weeks, the approved agricultural observation structure gradually rose above the ridge precisely where the original plans had placed it nearly 2 decades earlier. It was designed to monitor weather conditions across my fields, improve crop management, and support the forestry operation my father had planned years before. It was practical, fully compliant with county regulations, and completely lawful. It also changed the view from Cedar Hollow Estates exactly as the original county approval had always allowed. One Saturday morning, I drove past the subdivision on my way to the feed mill. Workers were replacing the large promotional sign at the entrance. The photograph of the endless mountain view was gone. So were the words permanent mountain views. Nobody held a press conference. Nobody apologized publicly. They simply stopped making promises the public record had never supported. A month later, the Homeowners Association held its annual meeting. This time there was no applause. Homeowners wanted answers. They asked why the board had never requested the archived county file. They asked why assumptions had replaced verification. They asked how a project affecting neighboring property had moved forward without anyone confirming the complete public record first. Vanessa Caldwell stood before the room and accepted responsibility for the board's decisions. She announced new procedures requiring independent verification of county records before any future project involving neighboring property could be approved. By the end of the evening, the homeowners elected a new board. As people quietly filed out of the clubhouse, I noticed several stopping to shake hands with one another instead of arguing. Sometimes the best outcome is not that someone wins. It is that everyone learns to ask better questions the next time. A few weeks later, Daniel Mercer stopped by the farm one final time. He told me Appalachian Timber Services had changed its own internal policy. Every permanent survey marker would now be personally verified in the field before heavy equipment entered any job site, regardless of what previous paperwork suggested. 1 extra hour with a survey crew, he said, beats spending the next 5 years explaining why you skipped it. Rebecca Lawson eventually closed the final binder, labeled it completed, and placed it on the shelf behind her desk. I have a feeling this one will stay there, she said with a smile. I hope so, I answered. Before winter arrived, I planted another row of young white oaks along the lower pasture. They would never replace the forest my father spent decades growing, at least not during my lifetime. That was never really the point. He planted those trees believing someone else would someday enjoy their shade. I finally understood what he meant. One evening, just before sunset, I climbed the observation structure carrying the same old coffee mug Eleanor had given me years earlier. The valley looked different than it once had, but the view reminded me of something Vanessa said on the morning my woods disappeared. Everyone finally gets the mountain view they paid for. Standing there, I realized she had been right in one unexpected way. Everyone eventually received exactly what they had earned. I received the lawful use of my own property. The county proved that careful records still mattered. Daniel reminded his industry why verification exists. And Cedar Hollow Estates learned a lesson no brochure could ever print. Ownership is not created by confidence, applause, or beautiful views. It is built one document at a time, protected one record at a time, and remembered long after the loudest voices have faded away.